Welcome to All Power to the Developing, a podcast of the Eastside Institute, where social justice, human development, and community building come together. This is where you will meet activists, artists, teachers, scholars, helpers, and healers who are bringing creativity, hope, and possibility to individuals and communities all over the world. Welcome to All Power to the Developing. This is your host, Desiree Wandin, Des for short, and thank you so much for tuning in to All Power to the Developing. Today we have a very special guest. Our guest today is an Ecuadorian-born, New Orleans-based interdisciplinary artist whose work lives at the intersection of performance, poetry, visual art, music, and cultural activism. Our guest practice is rooted in the lived experiences of immigrants and working-class communities, and it confronts systems of power with imagination, rigor, and deep humanity. Through projects like Aliens, Immigrants, and Other Evildoers, No Papers, No Fear, documenting the undocumented, and the Crescent City Sounds Project, American Mantra, Alien Green, our guest challenges dominant narratives while creating space for voices that are too often erased or silenced. Welcome to All Power to the Developing, Jose Torres Tama.
It's a pleasure to get a chance to do this with you. I was just being interviewed and I was talking to somebody, a while back. The work that I've been doing always is rooted in challenging the pervasive white supremacy that has always been a nature intrinsic to this culture, right? And growing up, having been born, I often say I was born in South America and raised in North America. I'm more American than most of you, right? And I have to often bring in humor because, immigrants, right? And I was born in Ecuador, and I was raised in New York, and I went to the Art Students League at the Art Students League in New York, very renowned on 57th Street. And as an interdisciplinary artist, I try to use various genres to approach the anti-immigrant hysteria that's always been a major theme within my work through a variety of genres. Because always felt that we have to use a variety of genres to really engage multiple audiences in addressing these challenges. And we couldn't be at a more grave situation right now.
Yes.
I was just interviewed with a poet friend of mine that came in from New Mexico, and I said to him, look, if they are killing white people in midday Minneapolis, people of color, we have no recourse really other than to continue to speak our minds, right? And ICE is basically the USA Gestapo. They are unchecked. And we have to remember, because the United States of amnesia seduces people to embrace forgetting, right? We have to remember that it was Bush who reorganized post 9/11 the Homeland Security situation, right? In addition, it used to be Immigration Naturalization Services, INS, and he redubbed them and reorganized them as ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. And we all know that in street slang, to ICE someone means to kill someone. So ICE, when he established ICE, he did it without any oversight. This is the one rogue organization. That's why it is rogue. There is no oversight. Right now, the Democrats are demanding for some kind of oversights, but they're only about 20-something years late, right? Because when Bush W, when he reorganized it, he reorganized ICE, that eventually has migrated to become the U.S. Gestapo. When you have organizations with no oversight, you're going to have abuse, because abuse of power should come as no surprise. And that's why I was just saying, the beacon, I've never believed the idea of this beacon of democracy. How can you have a beacon of democracy built on the indigenous slaughter and near genocide extermination of our Native American people, our indigenous people, right? In addition to stealing their lands, that's why, you often hear the statement now with activists, no human being is illegal on stolen lands, right? And then how can you perpetuate the so-called beacon of democracy, which I call the beacon of hypocrisy, with a situation where the enslavement of Africans was engaged in to build the nation, right? Build the system. And like, the White House itself, right? Built by African slaves. And it's very important for us to say enslaved African people because, in order for us to really address the colonization with a different vocabulary, we have to really challenge ourselves as activists with the language that we propagate, that we employ. Because if you just say the slaves, no, they were enslaved African people. Slaves make it sound like, well, they were slaves, so that's what they had to do. No, no. This system, again, the beacon of hypocrisy, enslaved African people to build the empire. And then, very important, because again, the United States of Amnesia reduces its people to embrace forgetting and therefore doesn't teach its history because it doesn't want to. This is the one system, the one nation, colonial settler system that does not like to teach its history because it's so full of blood. 1848, the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, because the United States invaded Mexico, and it was a very lesser known, what was it? President Polk, Polk, only 4-year president. His inaugural speech basically was one where he he drummed up, he started beating the drums to invade Mexico and steal the Southwest, the whole entire Southwest. That's all, the previous northern territories of Mexico, which the Spanish had controlled, and then Gringolandia came in. And what's really important to note is that, as always, you can always believe the treaties of the white man, right? And the Mexican people became a subjugated underclass. Yet within the 1848 Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, they were promised that if they own their properties, they can keep their properties. And of course, that never happened. And at the same time, what they did is they recruited German and Irish immigrants to help them invade the Southwest. And again, these are things that are not taught. So most of the time, even when I lecture at places like Brown University or, Duke or Cornell, right? And I was at Brown a couple of years, and I asked people if they know the 1848 Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, and a lot of times they don't even know. And then I say, well, if you don't know that, that's an important situation. You need to ask for your money back. Because even at these so-called high institutions, right, our people, our students, our people, especially our people of color, we are not taught the serious history. Like I recommend always a couple of books. One is called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, who's a New York scholar whom I actually had the chance to speak to him, when I was back up in New York and performing. But I also recommend The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And it opens up with Columbus, the so-called discoverer, basically preparing to rape and pillage, you know, because he never made it to the actual land that we called America now, but he made it to the islands. He was actually at Hispaniola, right, which is now, I think it's Puerto Rico or Cuba. I forget which one. But immediately he found the indigenous people, especially the Tainos. I think it was Puerto Rico, the Taino people. And what I love about Puerto Rico is that people are really still very proud of their indigenous heritage. But what he says in Howard Zinn's book, right, because Howard Zinn basically documented the papers of Columbus, he said, wow, these people are docile, peaceful, and friendly. With an army, with just a group of 50, we can enslave them all. I mean, that was his thinking, right?
Yes. So may I ask you a question? So first of all, thank you for all of that information. I hope our listeners got the 411 on what's going on. You have a lot of passion. That's the first immediate thing through your voice, the passion. This is very close to you. And you said you were born in Ecuador and grew up in New York. Can you take us to that early part of your childhood? What were some of the elements that you feel were there that gave you this level of passion and wanting you to go into this direction to explore all of these things? I mean, immigrants are from all over the world. Many people come to the States or go to other places and they're more content on and living there and assimilating, but you're really boisterous about the impact that history in the United States and other places have had on immigrants.
Absolutely. I think that's intrinsic to who I am. Now, granted, I was born in Ecuador but I was raised in New York in Manhattan. And when you're raised in Manhattan, you have a particular way of being. Like I tell people, I said, look, I've lived in New Orleans for 250 years. I love this city. It's a blue city in a deep red state. But above all, I'm a New Yorker. I studied arts, traditional drawing and figure drawing at the Art Students League on 57th Street. So that passion just comes from my being very much aware of what was happening. Like you couldn't fool me because I saw it. Like Irish and Italian cops would come into a Latino barrio in Jersey City and later in New York, because I lived in Washington Heights in New York, and they would beat heads and ask questions later. And you see that, so you see the hypocrisy right away. Like, wow, the so-called protect and serve, police, they're not there to protect and serve us. They're there to protect and serve the property owners. And post Katrina, I escaped on a stolen school bus 3 days after the levees breached. And you could see what was more important then: property, not the people. It was all about property. It's always been about property. That's why the slave militias were always about, you know, keeping, control of those who own the property. So it's the reason why I call it the beacon of hypocrisy. But that passion just comes from understanding. And also I do something really radical. I read. I actually read books, and I know in the 21st century, oh my God, oh my goodness, he's reading books that's so radical.
Get an
I
audiobook,
like
right?
myself I like myself a book, and I read plenty. I read the newspapers online and so all of that, right? But I've always loved, and on occasions that'll happen, I'll go to a coffee house and I'll actually buy a newspaper and read the newspaper, you know? I mean, I grew up in New York, so I used to read the New York Times continuously. And my family, we sold coffee in Union Square. So I have a terrible addiction to coffee. I'm already jacked up on 2 cups of coffee from this morning, right? So, when you have an ex New Yorker jacked up on coffee, there's going to be a lot of passion in there. And there's going to be a lot of boisterous nature. But it's because of what I know. You can't fool people when they study what you don't want them to study. This is the country, unlike Germany. Germany deals with the Holocaust. Germany actually, Trevor Noah does this great bit on the fact that, the Germans actually deal with the stains on their history. They address it. The United States never wants to address it. Look at right now. You have a Supreme Court right now that is as ugly and as conservative as the one with Woodrow Wilson back in the 1920s. And Woodrow Wilson was the first Southerner to rise to the captain's chair. I call it the captain's chair, the Oval Office. First Southerner. And yet when he was petitioning, and that was the growth of the NAACP, when he was petitioning the support of then the Negro people, right? He was promising that he would address the lynchings, because in the 1920s, the lynchings were all over the South. And here I am. I'm in a deep red state, but I'm cloaked and protected by the blue city of New Orleans. And, it's very important to also note that during the 1848 Guadalupe Largo Treaty that I mentioned earlier, if the Mexican property owners did not give their properties, away to the Germans that they recruited to come and help to eradicate them, entire families were lynched. So lynchings took place in the South for sure. We know a lot about that. But I've been doing research on the lynchings that took place in the Southwest, because Spanish was broken on the backs of every Mexican or Latino child forbidden to speak it, right? So in the process, they use the same segregation of the South to really diminish the Mexican and Latin American people of the Southwest and steal their properties. It's always been about stealing the properties. Look, Japanese internment, right? I just saw this little video of George Takei. Remember George Takei, he was one of my favorites in Star Trek, right? Warp Factor 5, Captain. He had that deep voice, right? And his family, he was just a child when his family was interned into the Japanese internment camps. And by who? FDR, right? FDR, who we regale and address as one of the better, the better, presidents. But they're all villainous. They all have their stains. Even I have to remind people that Obama deported 3 million people. And I say that in the United States of Amnesia. I had a New York scholar that I've been in touch with from New York. She came to see the show, and she said in the post-performance talk, she said, "I am so glad that you actually had the audacity and the courage to address Obama." So I do this section, it's United States of Amnesia show. I address the way that the country seduces people to embrace forgetting. So just to give you a little sense of it, I go, nobody wants, nobody wants to remember. Nobody wants to remember the brutal Barack Obama deportation apparatus. Who would have thought that the son of an African immigrant would rise to the captain's chair and migrate to the dark side, deporting more than 3 million plus abuelitas, abuelos, undocumented children, and it took undocumented immigrants, many of them teenagers and young people, to chain themselves to the iron fences of the White House to call out Obama for his deportation apparatus. Let's dare to remember. So I change voices all the time because I find that I have to, it's my way. I change personas, I change voices. It's my way in my performance pieces to keep audiences entertained and engaged. I like to believe that I engage at the highest level, right? With my live performances at the highest level, meaning that sometimes I tell people, look, it's like conceptual stand-up, It's and United States of Amnesia has, because I talk about the Indian Removal Act, I talk about United States of Amnesia, talk about addressing laws from the 3/5 Human Compromise way back, and I forget what year that one is, but I have them all memorized. Right now I'm going like to Indian Removal Act, 1830, and the character says, orderly, they called it Indian Removal Act. They weren't even trying to be subtle. They called it Operation Iraqi Freedom, right? So and that was Andrew Jackson, right? And who does this current Agent Orange of Chaos? Who does he, this Jabba the Hutt pimp that right now, a criminal, a convict that is in control of this apparatus? Who does he worship? Who does he regale? Andrew Jackson, one of the most odious and bloodiest presidents ever in the United States of Amnesia. Again, it's very important for the system to seduce its people to embrace forgetting. And that's why U.S. of Amnesia is the third piece of the immigration trilogy. The first one was the Cone of Uncertainty, the post-Katrina piece. Go ahead.
Thank you. We're going to take a short commercial break. I mean, Jose is on fire right now. He's giving us a lot of quick fire information, and I really appreciate it. I hope our guests and our listeners really appreciate it. We're going to be back right after these quick messages. When we come back, we're going to dip more into Jose's work, alien, immigrants, and other evildoers. No papers, no fear. American mantra, among many other things. We'll be right back on All Power to the Developing.
Thank you, brother. So I get carried.
Hi, I'm Melissa Meyer, Associate Director of the Eastside Institute. Welcome to All Power to the Developing. I hope you're enjoying today's conversation. In each episode, we introduce you to some amazing performance activists, play revolutionaries, and developmentalists from around the world who talk to us about their creative grassroots efforts to build a better world. If you like what you hear, please follow and share the series. You can find us on Amazon, Spotify, and Podbean. We'd love to hear your comments and ideas. Like everything at the Institute, the growth of All Power to the Developing depends upon the people who create it and benefit from it. We hope you're one of them. Thanks for your support, and now back to our conversation.
All right. We are back on All Power to the Developing with our guest, Jose Torres-Tama. I mean, he's been on fire before we went to commercial break, giving us a real historical breakdown of the oppression, of the amnesia, as he says, and of the kind of nefariousness of all of this as it's being executed on the people. But Jose doesn't just talk. He creates amazing pieces, shows, performances. And we're going to dip into that. No papers, no fear, documenting the undocumented. Can you go into that? First of all, when we say no papers, no fear, You know, papers, documentation, these are things that people need or should have. And when you don't have them, it's almost like you're not human. It's like you're not, you don't exist. And, even on like my driver's license, when it's like expired, they're like, oh, you got to go redo it because like it's not you anymore. And it's such a feeling that I would never want others to, as an immigrant myself, I'm an immigrant too from the Ivory Coast, can't come to this country. Can you really dip into that? I mean, the title is really strikes me, but no papers, no fear, documented the undocumented.
Right. So let's do that. So since the pilgrims arrived without paper, why were they not deported? With Columbus and his 3 ships, the Europeans were the first legal aliens in the hemispheric Americas. Take that to the bank, baby, darling, boo, hoo, you. So, again, I address the lies, right? Because the whole system, this whole colonial settler system has been built on lies, right? So the system perpetuates lies. And the fact that when I leave the house now, and especially in New Orleans, we just had swamp sweep. They call it, eventually they turned it to Catahoula Crunch, but we had the invasion of vice during the Christmas holidays. But they first called it swamp sweep. And then a lawyer friend of mine, he pointed out, he was Homero Lopez, who's one of the most amazing individuals you could imagine, a Tulane law graduate whose parents were Mexican immigrants, and he became a lawyer. He's one of the most amazing lawyers you can imagine. But he was interviewed on Democracy Now, and he addressed it. It was called swamp sweep. SS, right? Because of course they don't even think about, because it's in their subconscious, right? He goes, oh, they realized that it was swamp sweep. That was the first title for the invasion of New Orleans during the Christmas holidays. And then they moved it to Catahoula Crunch, which is using the Catahoula, which is the indigenous name for that particular swamp, the indigenous dog of the swamps here in New Orleans. But again, they're always trying to create basically titles to justify their invasions, right? Like the war on drugs, the war on poverty. It's always like a war. This is such a warring nation, you know. Like George Carlin says, there's no war on the homeless because there's no money in it, right? I also really look at comedians a lot. I'm a big fan of the work of George Carlin, of course, but Richard Pryor, individuals that are very socially inclined. It's very important because comedians use humor. That's why I always use humor within my performances, because humor is a seductive strategy and a seductive measure to engage your audiences, right? Like the project No Papers, No Fear, that's the actual mantra that is used by the immigrant activists, right? They're willing to go out into the streets and march and protest, even though they don't have the so-called papers. Yeah, and very important to what you said about your licenses, right? If you don't have that updated license, you need your ID, and supposedly this is a free country, but no, you need your ID, right? And now, if I travel, when I travel, of course, when I do my national touring projects, like I was just in Southern California and in the Los Angeles area, and they were invaded when I got there. I got there in November, and they had been invaded, the way Los Angeles was really invaded with this awful ICE, paramilitary Gestapo in the recent months, right? I was there in November. I was there for about 3 weeks, and I performed at Newbury Park outside of LA. And I performed quite often in Los Angeles, Southern Cal area. But they hadn't been invaded like a few months, and we saw all the videos of the atrocity committed by ICE against the people of Los Angeles. Many of them, U.S. citizens. But we remember that this is not new. It's just repeating itself. There was a law called Mexican repatriation. They gave it a nice little name, Mexican repatriation, but it was really about sending Mexicans and anyone that was Latin American back to their home countries, right? But really that happened during the Hoover administration, Republican Hoover, Herbert Hoover, I think it was. Yeah. So 1937, if you Google that, during the Great Depression, they said that too many jobs, Mexicans were taking too many jobs away from real U.S. citizens, which meant white people, and they were pulling them out of California, Southern Cal, Los Angeles, the neighborhood in East LA's Boyle Heights. And I've been there, right? And pulling people, putting them on trains and buses, and sending them deep back into Mexico. The estimates are like 60% of the people they pulled off the streets all across the country, but they went specifically to areas like California and Arizona, areas where the Southwest areas where they had plenty of Mexican people to attack. And they put them on trains, send them deep back into Mexico. And 60% of these people were actually U.S. born citizens, right? But again, the thing is that you got these people going, well, this is my country. No, it's not. It's never been your country, right? And look at the names, San Jose, San Diego, right? These are all, San Francisco, right? These are all Spanish-based names because previously those territories were controlled by the Spanish. But Polk, P-O-L-K, only a 4-year president, in his inaugural speech, he beats the drums of war. That, at the time, the Monroe Doctrine was being proposed, and right now we're hearing it again, the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, in terms of that the United States will decide the actual systems of government for the rest of the Americas, right? So as a child growing up in New York and New Jersey, I saw the hypocrisy of the fact that if you were black or brown, you were always discriminated against. I lived in Washington Heights, and tragically, the police there, Washington Heights is like Dominican Republic of New York, predominantly all Dominican people, right? Many of them Afro-Dominicans. But the police are still Italian and Irish and Polish, and they're brutal. I got stopped because I used to have Louisiana license plates. And of course, they approached me and thinking that I was selling drugs. I said, you would think that, right? Because that's what you want to believe because of your systems of racism. So what are you talking about? I said, come on, look at you. You're Italian. There was a time when the Italians were discriminated. There was a time when the Irish were discriminated against. But once they became police, they migrated into whiteness, and which allows them to give them the power to harass other people of color. So I've never believed in the beacon of democracy. That's why I call it the beacon of hypocrisy, because the place was founded on blood, genocide, and enslavement, and the appropriation of the northern territories of Mexico from Texas to California. So I don't believe the lies, and we have to really address how are these lies perpetuated? Hollywood, the Hollywood propaganda machine, the myth that the American dream is just. No. Fox News is 24-hour propaganda, but the real larger propaganda on the myth-making process of the beacon of democracy comes from the Hollywood machine industry. In fact, I'm doing a lot of research right now on Hollywood propaganda and the myth-making of the so-called, American democracy, right?
Yeah.
So we're at a challenging place. So the show that I tested, the visual art exhibit that I had, it was the first time I had a solo art show here since 2018, and it ended in late October of 2025. So it was up from Saturday, August 9th to October 22, 2025. So it was up for 3 months plus. And I called it No Papers, No Fear to address the fact that a lot of the work was inspired by the photographs, because I'm also a photographer, photographs I took of undocumented immigrants and their courage to protest. Because post-Katrina, I spent 10 years from 2010 to 2019 interviewing the immigrant workers here, many of them undocumented, but they gave their blood, their sweat, and their love to rebuild New Orleans post-Katrina.
Mhm.
And they've still been ignored, so
Like what happens oftentimes, unfortunately, you give your
yeah.
lifeblood, sweat, your back, and the buildings are built, and it's like on to the next. Can we speak about some of these others, aliens, immigrants, and other evildoers? And then you have the American mantra, Alien Green. Are those in the same vein as No Papers, No Fear, or do they cover things in a different light?
They address the anti-immigrant hysteria, but just a different approach. Aliens, Immigrants, and Other Evildoers is the actual solo performance. But what's really important, because above all, I consider the job of the artist is to chronicle. and tell people stories. That's what we do. We are chroniclers. So I chronicle, and that's informed by a docu-theater process, which means that it's informed by live interviews that I did, filmed interviews of immigrant workers. And there were 5 cities that I spent interviewing people. Pangea World Theater in Minneapolis, where there's a variety of immigrant people. And there I interviewed, Ecuadorians, Mexicans, El Salvadorians, African immigrants, and Asian immigrants as well. So I wanted to bring efficacy, real stories into the piece. And the same thing with aliens, immigrants, and other evildoers. I went to Tulsa and I interviewed. And evildoers is actually the term that W came up with, like when after 9/11 says, we're going to get them evildoers. And I thought W, Bush Jr. was always a mix between Porky Pig and Yosemite Sam. We're gonna get them evildoers, right? So that's my approach, and that's the way I had to be comedic about it. But it's true. I mean, right? Remember, he's the one that said, "I like presidenting," So and this Agent Orange of Chaos makes him look just like a schoolyard bully because he's so overtly criminal.
Mhm.
So we have to really have our antennas up. And I think as an artist, that's what I do. I have my antennas up and I keep up with what's going on. And I also tour. But that piece, Aliens, Immigrants, and Other Evildoers, that was the first piece where I intentionally set up interviews with undocumented immigrants in the cities of New Orleans, Houston, Tulsa, Minneapolis, and Washington, D.C.
Mhm.
These are
I have 2
cities.
questions for you.
Uh-huh.
Now, of course, your work is extremely, it shouldn't be, but it's extremely provocative. How are you received by the audiences? I'm sure if it's an audience that identifies with the struggle of being an immigrant, they easily identify with your work and are moved and feel the emotion. But I'm sure the other end of that stick may not be so ready to hear this message. So how was that experience for you? How are you received? And has your work changed, or have you had to change your work over the years because of things like that? You strike me as someone who does not care about censorship at all and would not bend and fold and break under that. So how has that been for you to create these pieces in a world where often, like you said, silences these types of voices?
That's a very good question. And the way I approach it is always to be strategically humorous. Like usually the first words you hear coming out of me, any poetic text, is immediately funny. Once I've got the audience laughing, I'm going to take them to some deeper, darker sides of difficult truths. But when I've got them laughing early on, like I just did a piece, I'm published in a couple of books of Katrina at 20, and No Papers, No Fear was a project that was Katrina at 20. It was the only cultural arts project that just happened because Katrina was in 2005 and we just passed 2025, right? August of 2005. So it's a 20-year cultural commemoration and difficult anniversary of that tragedy. But always I approach it with humor. For example, I'm in a couple of books published, a poetry book called Hurricanes Katrina and Rita at 20, and then another one called Counting Our Blessings that was published by the previous founder, African-American Mama Carol Babel, previous founder of the Ashe Cultural Arts Center, which is the premier African-American cultural center, which I am proud to say that they have commissioned a couple of my pieces and they present me there. And some of my artwork is there right now. So humor allows me to get in there and seduce people because I'm going to give them some difficult truths. So, for example, Aliens, Immigrants, and Other Evildoers begins with a spoken word poem, the actual performance. It says, green, I feel a little alien green, extraterrestrial green, my favorite Martian green, supposedly illegal to the green card, undocumented green, distrustful snake green, Oryzotella thespian green, broccoli of the many meals we pick for you green, guacamole, you can't live without green, jalapeno, jalapeno revolution, here we come green, green of your painful greenbacks that we earn with our green veins flush because of a resilient cactus green spirit that will boycott the Arizona venom green inside a law that leaks the pus green with infected minds and polluted battery acid green souls. But I know not all you green, not all you green, not all you gringos hate like that green greed that exploits immigrant labor and our green alien vulnerability as endangered as the swamp green of Louisiana, threatened by British petroleum logo green black oil spill, transforming the green-blue waters of the Gulf into a Greenpeace emergency, with their putrid green lies that the oil has disappeared into the ecosphere just like that. Ha! No human being is illegal. No human being is illegal. No human, no human, no human being is legal. Ningún ser humano es ilegal. Ningún ser humano es ilegal. So, and then I go into since the pilgrims arrived without papers, why? Why were they not deported? So I bring in some humor into it and allows me, but I'm also a spoken word performance poet, right? So when I was up in New York, the New York Poets Cafe, I won a number of their slams, and I would just go. I knew the directors and stuff, but I would just go and sign up because I didn't want to get any special treatment. I would just go and I'd win some slams. So they, after winning a couple slams, and in 1 week, I won 3 different slams. I won on a Monday, I won that slam, and then they said, all right, come on up on a Wednesday. The Wednesday competition gets a little bit stronger. I said, all right. And I won that slam. And they said, ooh, that's some good stuff. So come back on Friday. Friday is when all the winners from the previous month of slams, they all get a chance to, slam together. And I won that slam. And they were like, wow, so does this work from any of a larger pieces? I said, yeah, they're all from my performance solos. And they started producing my work. In fact, at one point, they invited me to try out, back in the day, back in the 90s, when I was back up in New York, the New York Poets Cafe would have a group that would tour as a New York Poets Cafe. So they had invited me, they would use 4. I did well, and I was the 5th. I was the alternative. And I was touring a lot at that time. I said, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to even be considered to be part of the New York Poets Cafe touring poets ensemble. But, that's where I would go and throw down. And what was really brilliant about the structure is that you had 3 minutes to throw down each poem. And you went 3 rounds of 3 minutes. So therefore, it sharpened my mind, and you had to have everything memorized, right? So in order for me to create these 3-minute pieces that eventually informed my solo work. But again, I use humor. For example, just recently, the Katrina 20s, I said, ladies and gentlemen, damas y caballeros, enchiladas y burritos, I bring to you an emergency report from the Army Corps of Engineers. They have just announced that they are creating a new state-of-the-art papier-mâché levee with all of the missing mail that New Orleans had not received in the many months after Katrina, right? So, and for those that live here, laugh because that's what happened. Post-Katrina, we didn't get our mail, right? So state-of-the-art papier-mâché levee, people start laughing, and then I go in and I present this poem that's in his book that's very critical of W and the abandonment, because when I was touring The Corner of Uncertainty, that's the first piece of the trilogy, The Corner of Uncertainty, Aliens, Immigrants, and Other Evildoers, second piece, and the third piece of the immigration trilogy is called United States of Amnesia. But when I was hearing The Corner of Uncertainty, post-New Orleans, post-Katrina, I was being interviewed up north, and one of the interviewers said to me, you describe it as an apocalyptic abandonment of a people by its government. I said, yeah, I lived it, and that's what it was. It was criminal and apocalyptic abandonment of a people by its government. And that's what it was. And they asked me, I said, did you not see the same thing on TV? Because while you might have seen it, I actually lived it. I got on a Stone school bus 3 days after the levees breach. I was on the same bus that the famous, iconic New Orleans native son, Alan Toussaint, was on. And, he eventually, when we got out, we were driven to the Baton Rouge airport, and from there, everybody went their way. He went up to New York, and that's when he got up to New York, and they began doing a documentary on him. And Toussaint was an amazing individual, right? He's like composer that has given so many songs and compositions to New Orleans and to artists across the country, right? So
Yeah.
again, I think the job of the artist above all is to chronicle their times. And that's what I try to do. And yes, there has been sometimes, some interesting responses from my audiences. When I performed in DC at this one theater, when I was doing the Cone of Uncertainty, during the middle of the show, when I went, because that piece really rails the W and the Bush administration that abandoned us. And there was this one woman, a white woman. It was one of those it was one of the kind of theaters that I like, where the audience at the bottom and then they have rafters and the audience is, because they get a chance to see well. And right during the time when I was really hitting hard on the Bush administration, this woman like went right through in protest, basically came down to the middle of the audience, and everyone could see because she's coming, and she's actually coming towards the stage. So I was a little bit concerned, but I was prepared. And she comes down and just like in a huff and a puff, and she comes towards me. I'm at center stage, and then she makes a quick left out the exit, and then I had to say, "Yes, the bathroom is that way," like immediately, because at first I thought, wow, is she gonna come down and get on stage? And I have to, and my mind's working because I did improv theater on the streets for so many years, so I always love messing with the audience. So yeah, that was the only one that I recall where it was,
Got a little dicey.
little dicey.
Yeah.
But oftentimes I get interviewed and I've had people say, "You're the kind of performance artist I really enjoy," because again, I use humor to seduce the audiences. And then once you use humor, you got them in your hand and they'll follow you to some more difficult challenge.
Yes,
It's
of
truth,
course. In closing, thank you so much, Jose, for all of the time and all of the amazing information that you've provided today. We're currently going through a very tough time with the topics that at hand, immigration enforcement. ICE has become a very aggressive and has intensified all over the United States. Of course, there's hot spots, but it's all over the United States. This is an area your work is rooted in for all of these years. So I'm sure right now there's so much fire in your belly at this time. What message do you have for immigrants, for people that aren't immigrants, that have sympathy and empathy for immigrants, people that have immigrant friends and coworkers and have been impacted by the great work of many immigrants of this country? What is your message in this current moment?
Well, thank you for asking that. The Sound Music Project, American Mantra / Alien Green, that's up on crescentcitysounds.org. If you go to crescentcitysounds.org, it'll be up there. You'll see it. You'll see a picture of me with my shirt that says "No Guacamole for Immigrant Haters." And I've been selling those shirts like hot tamales. That's where I use the humor, right? How do you love the food and demonize the cooks? Like, let's not forget, during the first round of the Agent Orange of Chaos, he called it the Kung Fu flu, remember? When he was attacking COVID, and he stirred up so much anti-Asian hatred, right? And of course, it was the Muslim ban. I mean, everyone was being attacked. But it's just a strategy it's a trope that's been repeated over and over again. We just have to deal with a difficult episode because look at where we're at. The economy is failing, everything. This man he has a concept of a plan. There's never been actually a plan. So for my immigrant brothers and sisters out there, and we are plenty and we contribute, I just can say, like I did, I had a talk with my mama this morning. My mama we migrated to New York City area because we had family there. That's the way usually migrations go. You've got family. We had family in New Jersey and family in New York. There's big Ecuadorian community in Queens, Minneapolis, and LA, right? And I just say to my brothers and sisters, keep the faith, but get out and vote no matter what. Unless this criminal cadre of criminals, start up a war, and you don't know, he might start up a war to keep the elections from coming. Because even Bannon, watch the news, even Bannon was mentioned at one of these CPACs. He said, if we don't win the elections, we're going to be voted out, and we're going to go to prison. They know they're criminals. The thing is that they know they're criminals. They're blatant about it, right? But there's no more dignity, and the Republicans are finally some of them are finally getting a spine in their backs, and they're addressing all the criminal acts. I'm a big fan of the work of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's an African-American woman in Congress, Crockett, I think is her last name, and she's doing a lot of great work to expose. You got to speak up. Don't be afraid. Bullies do well when you're silenced and are afraid. So, it shows continuously. The chump, and I don't like to say his actual name because I think every time you say his name, another blind white in ashes gets his Confederate flag in his wings, right? So I have to just say, keep the faith, get out there and vote and speak up, because we just saw the protest. The one thing that democracies, so-called democracies have is that people protest and people fill the streets. The public protests are super important. And when they do that, the governments get worried, whether it was Vietnam against LBJ or what just went on in Minneapolis, right? And we just had a major protest here in New Orleans. There's been protests all across the country. So that's the most important. Gather, organize, and instigate public protest, but do not remain silent. Remaining silent feeds the power structure. Public protest scares governments, because we're actually, especially this so-called democracy, right? It scares governments because we're actually employing our public right for public protest. So protest, organize, and speak your mind. Speak your voices against the situation. Do not be afraid. Bullies do well when they intimidate people into silence.
Thank you so much for that, Jose. And lastly, you mentioned Crescent City Sounds Project. If people would like to keep in touch with your work, if people would like to get in touch with you, if people would like to buy one of those fly t-shirts, how could they do that?
They can go to TorresTama.com, TORRESTAMA.com, TorresTama.com. They can buy the No Guacamole from Immigrant t-shirts that supports the project. But I have to tell you, I'm in the process of ordering more because they've been selling like hot tamales, right? No Guacamole from Immigrant. Again, that's a comedic way. I had someone tell me, man, that is such a great comedic way to address this anti-immigrant hysteria, right? And like, how do you love the food and demonize the cooks, right? So how do you love, I grew up in New York. I grew up on Chinese food, I'm vegetarian. And whenever I'm traveling, it's like, I try to find myself a Chinese place because I want to order a Buddha's Delight, right?
Nice.
I want to get me some wonton soup. No, not wonton, but the egg drop soup, right? So, I grew up in New York where we have great falafels and, Middle Eastern food, right? So what we're also witnessing is the trifecta of tragedies. Palestine, right? The anti-immigrant hysteria here, and the wars in Africa. We always forget about Africa, but they're experiencing
Sudan,
the Sudan. So we're experiencing a trifecta of tragedies, but we can't lose hope. Like, my mama is an undying optimist, and I have, it was me and my mom. I was raised by a single mother for quite some time. How many single mothers are out there raising amazing kids, right? And that is courage. My mother got remarried, and it's all good. But I was here with just me and my mama for the first number of years here in up north, right? So for our good people of color, especially, I've got another t-shirt I'm working on called Melanin People of Power, because that's what we are. We are melanin people of power, right? So, but they can go to the site and order the No Guacamole from Immigrant Haters t-shirts. All they have to do is put up No Guac, and the site comes up. But they could reach out to me, and they could email me via the website. But go to TorresTama.com, and if you go to Crescent City Sounds, you can hear freely the full American Mantra / Alien Green spoken word music project. But I want to thank you for having me on here.
Definitely. And we would like to thank once again Jose Torres Tama for being on All Power to the Developing. Such an amazing guest. And I hope everyone buys one of those shirts. I'm about to reach out for 2 of those shirts. I got my summertime gear ready. If you would like to continue your journey with All Power to Developing, we would love for you to subscribe, like, comment, share. We're on all major digital streaming platforms. from Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and on and on and on. Please share, subscribe, like, listen. And if you would like to write to us and let us know what you enjoyed about the episode or other episodes, you can write to us at podcast@eastsideinstitute.org. I repeat, that is podcast@eastsideinstitute.org. We would love to read your response at the end of an episode. Torres, thank you so much. Jose Torres Tama, thank you so much. And we might get you back in the future, man. You have a lot of great things to say. But we're going to continue this, and all power to the developing. Was made possible in part by Growing Social Therapeutics, the Baylor Wolf Fund.